When 27-year-old Monique Ellis pulls over to fix her SUV, she doesn't expect to rescue a billionaire's daughter or uncover a tech empire built on destroying Black-owned startups. What begins as a roadside encounter turns into a national reckoning. This is the story of sabotage, truth, and the quiet revolution that rewrote the rules of power, led by women the system never saw coming. The midday sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of a back road in rural Arizona, where 27-year-old Monique Ellis sat behind the wheel of her beat-up SUV, hood popped, hands greasy, and patience wearing thin. She had spent the last 8 years building her energy startup from scratch, only to watch it collapse in slow motion after a major investor ghosted her during the due diligence phase. Weeks earlier, she'd made headlines as a promising Black founder receiving a coveted pitch slot at a renewable energy accelerator. Now, she was sleeping in her car and selling off hardware just to keep the lights on in her tiny apartment. The silence was broken by the sound of tires kicking up dust in the distance. A silver coupe approached, sleek, quiet, too clean for this stretch of nowhere. Monique wiped her hands and stood tall as the car slowed. But instead of stopping to help, the driver, tall, pale, wearing mirrored sunglasses, rolled down his window just enough to bark a question. "You seen a white girl around here? Blonde. Might be on foot, might have asked for a ride." Monique kept her voice even. "Just me and my busted radiator out here." "Haven't seen anyone all day." The man studied her with a practiced gaze, eyes darting to her license plate, the contents of her trunk, the logo still faintly visible on the side of her battery prototype. He didn't see a woman down on her luck. He saw a profile, a type, a potential liability, and after a long pause, he gave a clipped nod and drove off, the tension lingering like static in the air. Seconds later, a soft knock echoed from her cargo hold. The rear hatch creaked open from inside, revealing a young woman in her mid-20s, hair disheveled, expensive jogging gear streaked with sweat and red dirt. She blinked at Monique with wide, pleading eyes. "Thank you. I thought they had me." Monique didn't respond. Not immediately. Her heart was pounding. Not from fear, but from something heavier, suspicion, exhaustion, the unmistakable sensation of being pulled into a story much bigger than her. The girl introduced herself as Reagan Vaughn, daughter of Barrett Vaughn, billionaire CEO of Vaughn Systems, the defense tech conglomerate that had recently secured controversial government surveillance contracts. Reagan wasn't just running away from home. She was fleeing with a terabyte of data, recordings, financials, internal memos. All of it implicating her father and his top executives in a sprawling scheme of fraud, illegal lobbying, and the targeted suppression of minority-led startups, including Monique's. Reagan didn't expect Monique to believe her. Most people wouldn't. Most people would have turned her in for a reward. But Monique wasn't most people. She had lived on the receiving end of systemic sabotage long enough to know when a story wasn't just convenient, it was probable. They drove off together, windows down, hearts racing, as the desert heat shimmered on the horizon. Neither spoke for the first few miles. Each was doing her own quiet calculus. For Monique, it wasn't about trust, it was about leverage, about timing, about the slim, sliver-thin possibility that this bizarre, messy moment could become a fulcrum, not just for personal redemption but for something bigger. And in that silence was a truth rarely captured in stories of rebellion and whistleblowing, the emotional weight of collision. For Reagan, this was an unraveling. For Monique, it was another mask to wear, another line to walk between survival and sacrifice. What began as a random roadside breakdown was quickly becoming something else. A confrontation with the cultural myths of meritocracy, the psychological toll of being both visible and erased, and the hidden cost of choosing justice when silence is safer. They weren't allies yet, but the gears had shifted, and by the time they reached that dirt turnoff, Reagan wasn't just a runaway, and Monique wasn't just another failed founder. They were two women about to expose a machine that had been devouring futures for decades. One algorithm, one contract, one silenced entrepreneur at a time. The wooden cabin was older than either of them expected. Dust clung to the corners like a second skin. The walls were lined with yellowing real estate pamphlets and forgotten tools. Monique dropped her duffel next to the fireplace and looked around for anything that resembled Wi-Fi. Reagan, still catching her breath, found a signal booster tucked inside a cabinet. The property had once belonged to her grandfather, a forgotten piece of land purchased for a development project that never materialized. It had no official surveillance ties to her father's empire. That was the point. Monique plugged her laptop into a portable battery and inserted the encrypted drive Reagan had risked everything to steal. For a moment, the screen stayed black. Then it blinked to life. One folder, then 24, then hundreds. Contracts, emails, shell company filings, recordings, and finally, a top-level directory labeled Targeted Ventures, Suppression Strategies. She scrolled. Her hand froze when she saw a familiar name, Volt Edge Energy. It was her company, the startup she had built from the ground up, the same one that had seen its valuation evaporate when two venture partners abruptly pulled their funding. She clicked on a file. It was a memo detailing a coordinated effort to smear Volt Edge through anonymous regulatory complaints, data leaks, and media manipulation. Her company hadn't failed because it wasn't viable. It had been sabotaged, strategically, surgically, and coldly. The irony wasn't lost on her. In America's so-called innovation economy, failure is supposed to be a badge of honor. But that story never includes founders like her. Black, female, bootstrapping from scratch with no generational wealth, no safety net, and no second chances. The files revealed the names of the same investors who had promised mentorship and capital. All of them had links to Vaughan systems through subsidiary partnerships and political lobbying groups. It wasn't just corporate competition. It was systemic elimination. Reagan watched Monique's expression tighten, arms crossed as she leaned against the cracked window frame. "I didn't know it would go that far," she said quietly. "I mean, I knew my father was ruthless. But this, targeting companies just to keep control of defense and energy contracts?" Monique's reply came without turning her head. "You knew enough to run." Outside, a hawk circled above the treetops. Inside, the truth sat between them like a live wire. This wasn't just about business malpractice. It was about institutionalized exclusion hiding behind market logic. Behind the buzzwords of disruption and innovation was a scorched earth campaign against founders who didn't fit the mold. Reagan's betrayal of her father wasn't just personal, it was cultural. She was raised in a world where wealth justified cruelty and loyalty meant silence. To walk away from that wasn't bravery alone. It was also a rupture. The girl who once toured Ivy League campuses with donor plaques bearing her last name was now sleeping in the woods with a woman whose entire future had been erased by the same machine. Monique's phone buzzed with a notification. She checked it. It was from a startup group chat she hadn't muted. A friend had just posted a link to a government press release about new military technology partnerships. Vaughan Systems was listed as the lead contractor on 3 of them. And yet, according to one of the PDFs on the flash drive, those contracts were secured through fraudulent financial disclosures and promises of regulatory favors. She read the text of the announcement aloud. "This innovation award," Monique said, voice flat, "is being given to a company that deleted 20 Black-founded ventures from the map." Reagan said nothing. She just sat down on the floor and hugged her knees. The problem wasn't just the corruption, it was the way the system rewarded it. Antitrust laws designed to prevent monopolies had been rendered toothless by loopholes and political donations. Small business grants that were supposed to uplift marginalized founders were underfunded and selectively awarded. Legal accountability was performative at best, until someone with inside access broke the silence. Monique didn't need to hear any more. She needed proof, strategy, and people who wouldn't blink when power started fighting back. She closed the laptop, face unreadable. "Tomorrow, we drive into the city," she said. "There's someone I know, a woman who once tried to help me when nobody else would. She's not cheap, she's not flashy, but she doesn't flinch." They slept in shifts that night, one always keeping watch. Somewhere in a high-rise across the state, Barrett Vaughn was shouting into a phone, demanding answers. His daughter had disappeared. The tracker in her phone had gone dead, and there were whispers that the encrypted vault holding his darkest secrets had been compromised. He dismissed most of the threats. People like him always did. He assumed she'd come back, apologize, be coaxed into silence with enough money. What he didn't expect was that she'd already teamed up with someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. The next morning, with the sunrise bleeding through the treetops, Monique packed the flash drive into a small pouch and tucked it under her hoodie. She glanced at Reagan. "You sure you want to see how deep this goes?" Reagan nodded. "I already saw it. I just didn't believe it until now." They drove east, away from the quiet, away from the trees, toward a world where billionaires were untouchable, justice was elusive, and truth had to be weaponized to be heard. But this time, the story wouldn't be written by men in boardrooms. It would be carried by two women who refused to be silent. The cabin was silent, save for the rhythmic hum of a hard drive spinning to life. A small solar panel outside provided enough power to keep Monique's laptop running, the glow from the screen illuminating her face in the dim room. Dust floated through the beams of morning light like static, and the air smelled of cedar and stale insulation. Monique sat cross-legged on the floor, fingers gliding across the trackpad as line after line of data scrolled past. Reagan sat a few feet away on a faded couch, arms wrapped around her knees, still processing what she had risked her life to bring. The flash drive, which looked unremarkable in her palm just yesterday, now felt heavier than either of them expected. They had spent hours combing through the documents, thousands of files, categorized under bland project names and numerical codes. But one folder stood out. It was labeled Asset Control, Strategic Suppressions. Monique opened it. Inside were timelines, budgets, and performance charts. But nothing was about building new products. Everything focused on eliminating competition. She clicked on a video file. The screen flashed to life, showing a boardroom filled with executives from Vaughn Systems. Barrett Vaughn sat at the head of the table, reviewing a chart. "This startup is already gaining traction with city infrastructure contracts," he said, pointing at a projected line climbing steeply on a graph labeled Volt Edge. "Let's get ahead of it." Someone in the room replied, "Legal?" "Already drafting a case. Minor IP conflict. Enough to stall them." Barrett nodded once. "Good. Reach out to Funsys and Capwise. Pull the investment offers." Quietly, Monique stopped the video. Her chest felt tight. She had suspected sabotage before. But to see it so plainly, to watch men in tailored suits conspire to dismantle something she'd built by skipping meals and maxing out credit cards, struck a different nerve. Reagan sat up. "I knew about the acquisitions," she said. "I didn't know how far it went." "It was never about the product," Monique replied. "It was about control and fear. They couldn't own us, so they erased us." The next document hit even harder. It was a predictive model generated by Vaughan Systems' internal AI tool, assessing which Black and Latino-founded startups posed the most long-term risk to their market dominance. The criteria weren't just technological innovation or user growth. It included media buzz, demographic appeal, and a likelihood of gaining grassroots funding. Monique scrolled down and saw her own face, grainy and cropped from an old profile feature in Wired Equity. Below it, a threat level score, 8.7 out of 10. Next to it, an action recommendation, delay capital access, apply legal friction, initiate media campaign, Q2. Monique exhaled sharply. This was never about merit. It was never about ideas. Reagan leaned forward. "You're not the only one. Look at this." She pointed to a cluster of names in another file. Founders, almost all of them people of color, whose companies had mysteriously folded after promising launches. A few had sued, most hadn't. Some had simply disappeared from the ecosystem, stories untold. These weren't isolated failures. They were orchestrated outcomes. Outside, a storm was starting to brew. Clouds gathered like bruises across the sky, and the wind picked up. But inside that cabin, the temperature dropped for a different reason. "This is federal," Monique said. "These contracts, these manipulations, they're not just business violations, they're crimes." Reagan stood. "Then we take it to someone who can make it matter." Monique shook her head. "Not yet. We go public too early, they bury it, or us. We need someone who knows the system from the inside, someone who can help us move without being seen." She closed the laptop, eyes resolute. "There's a lawyer. She's tough, she's clean, and she helped me once, back when nobody else even returned my calls." Reagan nodded. "Let's find her." That night, the two women barely slept. Monique stayed by the window, watching every shadow shift. Her mind replayed every investor meeting, every news article about her missteps, every instance of coded doubt disguised as feedback. She now understood it for what it was. Not just bias, but weaponized exclusion backed by billion-dollar systems. And Reagan, curled up in the corner of the room, felt the quiet unraveling of her own identity. She had always believed that wealth came with responsibilities. Her father had shown her otherwise, but it wasn't just disappointment she felt, it was shame and clarity. By dawn, they had a plan. Drive east, reach the city, find the woman who once stood alone in courtrooms challenging corporate giants, and show her the data that could bring the empire down. The cabin, with all its peeling paint and broken hinges, had become something else entirely. A war room, a birthplace of accountability. They didn't hug, they didn't cry, there wasn't time for that. They just loaded the car and left the woods behind. What they carried wasn't just a drive, it was a mirror, reflecting an ecosystem built on discrimination and fear. And they were done hiding from it. The law office didn't look like much. Tucked between a discount pharmacy and a used bookstore on the edge of East Oakland, it bore a weather-worn sign, Maya Alston, Civil Rights and Corporate Litigation. The glass was tinted, the lights inside dim. But for Monique, it felt like arriving at a safe house carved out of the system itself. She parked across the street and looked over at Reagan. "You good?" Reagan gave a slow nod, her jaw tight. "Let's just hope she doesn't slam the door in our faces." They walked in together. The air smelled like paper and burnt coffee. A receptionist greeted them with a tired smile and led them to the back office. Maya Alston stood behind her desk, arms folded, framed by a corkboard covered in sticky notes and news clippings. 44 years old, salt and pepper twists pulled back into a low bun, no makeup, no pretense. Her eyes narrowed as Monique stepped forward. "I haven't seen you in a minute. Last time, you told me I was 5 weeks too late to stop the buyout. Maya let the silence stretch, then nodded once. What do you have? Monique handed over the flash drive. You'll want to sit for this. Maya didn't sit. She watched the video clips, read the memos, scanned the spreadsheets with a lawyer's muscle memory. She said nothing until the final document loaded, the suppression index, complete with demographic targeting and predictive threat scores. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and cold. This isn't just a smoking gun. This is a matchbook in a room full of gasoline. Reagan stepped forward. We want to bring it down, all of it. Maya looked her over. You're the daughter, right? Barrett Vaughn's? Reagan nodded. Maya's gaze lingered on her for a long time. Then she turned back to Monique. You trust her? I trust what's on that drive, and I trust what she risked to get it to me. Maya nodded once more. Then we're gonna need help. She reached for her phone and sent a single message. Code black. I need you. 20 minutes later, a knock came at the back door. Zoe Kim arrived wearing a denim jacket covered in iron-on patches, a laptop bag slung across her shoulder. She was 33, Korean-American, and easily one of the most paranoid people Monique had ever met, which was exactly why they needed her. She walked in, nodded at Maya, and dropped into a chair. So who pissed off the Empire this time? Maya handed her the drive. You'll see. Zoe plugged it in, cracked her knuckles, and got to work. Within minutes, she had isolated Vaughn Systems' server protocols, mapped out access pathways, and found evidence of secure tunnels linking corporate records to offshore accounts. Most damning of all, she discovered a dormant login credential, one assigned to a Vaughn family member, still active. That's your key, she said, looking at Reagan. Reagan hesitated. I can't do this alone. He always had IT double-check everything. Zoe smiled. You won't be alone. But we need to move fast. Once they figure out this data's in the wild, they'll start locking doors. The team quickly set up shop in an Airbnb loft across the city, using burner phones and VPN chains to mask their location. Zoe handled the digital infrastructure. Maya reviewed legal statutes and lined up whistleblower protections. Monique organized the data into a compelling narrative. And Reagan, who had once coasted through life on her last name, worked through every login credential, every financial trail, and every confidential Slack conversation she'd archived without realizing their importance. They called it the Quiet Storm. No press, no leaks, just 4 women building a case powerful enough to collapse a billion-dollar machine. Outside, the news kept moving. Vaughn Systems was still getting government contract. Tech conferences still praised entrepreneurial grit, while ignoring the data on race-based funding gaps. DEI programs were still being challenged in courtrooms across the country. None of it had changed. Not yet. But inside that loft, the narrative was shifting. For the first time, Monique felt like she wasn't yelling into the wind. Every late-night meeting, every investor that smiled and lied, every algorithm that flagged her business as high risk without ever saying why. It was all here, in hard numbers and cold language, stripped of excuses. One night, as Maya pored over an evidence packet, she paused. There's a judge on this list. Who? Reagan leaned over her shoulder. Judge William Crane. He's been ruling on antitrust cases for 10 years, and he's ruled in Vaughn's favor 9 out of 10 times. Zoe pulled up campaign finance reports. Over $500,000 in PAC donations, all traced back to shell companies owned by Vaughn Systems subsidiaries. Monique let out a breath. This isn't just corporate abuse, it's structural corruption. And that, Maya said, is what makes it federal. They knew now that going public wasn't enough. They needed the Department of Justice. They needed oversight bodies. They needed congressional attention. The evidence had to be ironclad, undeniable, timed perfectly. No premature leaks, no hero moments, just strategy. By the end of the week, they had 3 targets: expose the suppression program, document the judicial corruption, and reveal the financial web that held it all together. They weren't just planning a takedown. They were laying the groundwork for a new system. In a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of Vaughn Systems' San Francisco headquarters, Barrett Vaughn didn't look worried. He was furious, but not worried. The CEO paced like a man used to obedience, surrounded by security analysts, legal counsel, and 3 marketing strategists too afraid to meet his eyes. She's one person. My daughter, 26 years old. What's she going to do? Start a revolution with a flash drive? He tossed a surveillance photo across the table. It showed Reagan stepping into a car with Monique Ellis. The image was grainy, caught from a gas station camera in Stockton. And her? A failed energy founder. I had to look her up. She's a nobody. A quiet snort from the corner earned a sharp glare. Problem? No, sir. The room stayed tense. Barrett believed what many powerful men believed, that influence made them invincible. He had built Vaughn Systems with precision and aggression, contracts with federal defense agencies, donations funneled through third parties, politicians on both sides of the aisle who owed him favors. His system wasn't just strong, it was designed to self-heal. Any damage would be absorbed, redirected, repackaged. But he didn't understand the threat he was facing, because what Barrett couldn't measure, what no algorithm in his arsenal could predict, was what happened when you underestimated people like Monique Ellis. She didn't move like a disruptor. She didn't have investors, no viral pitch decks, no big media appearances. To the world, she was a failed founder in a crowded space, and that's exactly what made her dangerous. In the rented loft just 6 miles from Vaughn Systems' West Campus, Monique stared at a whiteboard filled with arrows, names, and dates. Zoe had layered in live server traffic from Vaughn's internal networks, flagged every legal gap they could exploit, and created secure backups on 3 continents. They'd already uncovered 5 shell companies registered in Nevada, all tied to contract skimming on government tech grants. Each was linked back to Vaughn's executive finance team. The bribes were disguised as consulting fees and routed through shadow banking platforms in the Caribbean. What they had now wasn't just enough for a scandal. It was enough for indictments. But they were still quiet, no leaks, no press tips. Monique knew how the game worked. Going public too soon would give Vaughn's team time to bury records, silence insiders, rewrite the story. Reagan sat beside her, phone in hand, scrolling through her father's calendar. His upcoming keynote at the Global Innovation Summit would be televised. It was the perfect moment. Public eyes, corporate stakeholders, federal agents nearby under the pretext of conference security. That's where we do it, Monique said. Live. Maya agreed. It would be clean, strategic, undeniable. But even as the plan formed, Monique couldn't shake a feeling, one that had shadowed her for years. The constant pressure to be twice as prepared, twice as articulate, to never make mistakes because the system would never forgive hers the way it forgave others. It was the burden of representation, of walking into every room knowing you were already being sized up for failure. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against the myth that failure among Black founders was always earned, that underfunding was merit-based, that the system wasn't rigged. And now, the man who had written her off as collateral damage was about to watch the blueprint unravel in real time. In his tower, Barrett looked out over the skyline, confident in his reach. In their loft, Monique looked across her team. 4 women who had no reason to trust each other weeks ago, and now shared everything. That was the real power of being underestimated. It gave them time, and it gave them the element of surprise. The Vaughn Systems auditorium gleamed under stage lights, its white and chrome walls reflecting the polished spectacle of power. Rows of media crews, tech executives, and government officials packed the room. They weren't just attending a keynote. They were witnessing a coronation. Barrett Vaughn stood center stage, flanked by giant digital displays showing charts, logos, and glossy promotional reels. The Global Innovation Summit was in full swing, and Vaughn Systems had just announced its largest corporate acquisition yet, a $2.3 billion merger with a logistics AI firm specializing in defense supply chains. This acquisition represents the future of national infrastructure, Barrett said, smiling for the cameras. Vaughn Systems continues to lead with innovation, transparency, and impact. Applause echoed across the room. Investors nodded. Reporters typed fast. No one noticed the black woman in the third row, dressed in a slate-gray suit, her gaze steady beneath wire-rimmed glasses. Monique Ellis didn't blink. In the control booth at the back of the auditorium, Zoe Kim tapped her keyboard with surgical precision. On her screen were 5 synchronized triggers. Next to her, Reagan Vaughn stared at the countdown timer. "It's almost time," Zoe said quietly. Behind the stage, Maya Alston checked her earpiece. She was standing by the VIP entrance, clipboard in hand, posing as a legal advisor for a visiting ethics panel. The badge was fake. The resolve was not. Barrett continued. He was at his peak, confident, commanding, unaware. "Let's talk numbers," he said, gesturing toward the screen behind him. With this merger, he never finished. Every phone in the auditorium buzzed simultaneously. The screens flickered. Then, without warning, a new message took over. The truth about Vaughn Systems. Confusion rippled through the crowd. The screens cut to video, boardroom meetings, emails, charts. A security cam feed showing a younger Monique presenting at a startup expo, labeled with a threat index. A voiceover followed, calm and clear. "My name is Reagan Vaughn, the daughter of Barrett Vaughn. What you're seeing is internal documentation, proof of systemic sabotage, illegal suppression of minority-led startups, financial fraud, and judicial corruption." Barrett froze. He looked toward the wings. Security scrambled. "This is a cyber attack," he growled. But no one was shutting it down. The feed was being relayed through a distributed network, carefully timed and mirrored through media servers around the world. Zoe's setup made sure of that. Reporters raised their cameras. Screens displayed spreadsheets of PAC contributions traced to federal judges. Email threads with subject lines like strategic delays, Q2 suppression targets. A chart titled Demographic Risk Factors in Competitive Ventures. Maya stepped on stage. "This isn't a cyber attack. This is disclosure." The crowd erupted in a frenzy of questions. But one voice cut through. "Mr. Vaughn," shouted a reporter near the front, "do you deny targeting Black and Latino-founded companies?" Another reporter stood. "What about the false legal filings tied to Voltage Energy?" Barrett tried to compose himself. "These are fabrications, political attacks. My daughter has been manipulated." A new clip began playing. It showed Reagan speaking directly to camera. "I wasn't manipulated. I made a choice. I saw what my father built. I saw who it crushed, and I couldn't stay silent." Barrett's face turned crimson. "Cut the feed," he yelled. "It's not on the feed, sir," his technician said. "It's on the mainframe." At that moment, 2 federal agents entered through the rear. They wore plain clothes, badges discreet but visible. One approached Barrett's security chief. The other spoke into his collar mic, eyes on target. Barrett tried to leave the stage. Maya stepped forward. "You remember me?" He paused. Recognition flickered. "You represented that energy company. What was it called?" "Voltage," Monique said from her seat, rising. "You buried it." The room fell quiet. Barrett blinked, then scoffed. "That's what this is about? A personal vendetta?" "No," Monique said. "It's about all of us. All the founders you erased because we didn't fit your algorithm. Because we didn't look like your boardroom." Reporters surged forward. Cameras rolled. Barrett turned to his team. "Do something." They didn't move. Even his inner circle had stopped pretending this could be walked back. An agent stepped up. "Barrett Vaughn, you are under arrest on charges of fraud, bribery, antitrust violations, and obstruction of justice." Barrett tried to protest, but the words didn't land. The crowd had moved on. Some were already calling the story the most important tech reckoning of the decade. Others were streaming the footage live, as hashtags like #Vaughn collapse and #Founders strike back began trending within minutes. In the hallway, just beyond the auditorium, Reagan slumped against a wall, breathing hard. Zoe walked up beside her. It worked. Reagan nodded slowly. "Yeah." But that was just the first part. The fallout began immediately. Vaughn Systems stock plummeted in pre-market trading. Government contract reviews were launched by the Office of Federal Procurement. Tech journalists flooded social media with archives of old cases, newly relevant in light of the disclosures. By evening, the SEC had opened an inquiry. The DOJ released a statement citing ongoing cooperation with key whistleblowers. Maya was on her third interview with a national news outlet, and Monique. She sat in the back of a quiet bar, watching the news scroll across the screen. Her face wasn't in the headlines, but her impact was. She pulled out a napkin and started sketching. A business model, a new one. Zoe looked over her shoulder. "You're building again?" "Number. I'm building different. And this time, no one's going to shut it down." 3 weeks after the press conference, the world was still catching up. Headlines rotated through phrases like corporate meltdown, the Vaughn files, and America's quietest civil war. In congressional halls, hearings began. Lawmakers, some of whom had quietly accepted contributions from shell corporations tied to Vaughn Systems, were now scrambling to distance themselves. The documents Monique, Reagan, Maya, and Zoe had revealed didn't just destroy a company. They cracked open an entire ecosystem of complicity. But the biggest shock wasn't the arrest of Barrett Vaughn. It was what came next. Monique Ellis turned down every interview. No morning shows, no think pieces, no book deals. Instead, she filed paperwork with the Secretary of State's office to establish a new public benefit corporation, Equigrid, a digital infrastructure incubator focused on minority-led ventures in clean energy, fintech, and civic tech. She didn't want a company that competed in the old market. She wanted to build a new one. The settlement money awarded to whistleblowers and harmed businesses from the Vaughn fallout became seed capital. So did the voluntary restitution fund Reagan launched using the liquidated assets from her family trust. Monique, now sitting at the helm of a war-forged coalition, began constructing an ecosystem where inclusion wasn't a checkbox. It was baked into the core. From the outside, it looked like a startup accelerator. But behind the scenes, it was more than that. It was a prototype for what economic justice could look like. Legal clinics were embedded into every cohort. So were mental health consultants. Licensed therapists trained to support founders dealing with racial battle fatigue, imposter syndrome, and trauma from systemic exclusion. Investors had to commit not just capital, but accountability, transparent reporting on portfolio diversity, bias mitigation policies, and exit strategies that benefited communities, not just cap tables. Policy groups took notice. So did journalists. Equigrid wasn't just creating businesses, it was remapping power. Within 6 months, it launched its first 5 ventures. All 5 were led by women of color. 2 landed 6-figure government pilot contracts without going through the usual maze of backdoor lobbying. 1 startup, a Black-led energy optimization firm, secured a grant through a newly restored Department of Energy program that had previously been slashed during deregulation pushes. Congressional briefings began referencing the Equigrid model as a template for future tech equity programs. Meanwhile, Reagan Vaughn, no longer protected by her last name, took on a quieter role as Director of Accountability at the newly formed Founders Rebuild Foundation. Her job was to help victims of corporate suppression file claims, access restitution, and navigate re-entry into the startup space. There was public skepticism at first, but her commitment was real. She spent her days off-site. She worked without a title for the first 2 months, and she refused any press that framed her as a savior. "I wasn't brave," she said in a closed-door donor meeting. "I was late." Zoe, who once preferred shadows to spotlights, now ran digital security for both Equigrid and the foundation. Her team developed an open-source surveillance detection tool used by over 100 startup founders who had reason to believe they were being monitored or suppressed. The code was public. The data was anonymous, but the message was clear. They were watching now, too. As for Maya Alston, her inbox was flooded. The DOJ invited her to consult on new whistleblower protections. Several states requested her input on corporate transparency legislation. But she kept her law office small, the sign still crooked above the door. Because her work wasn't about scaling. It was about holding ground. On a rare evening off, the 4 women met again, this time in the basement of a community tech hub. No cameras, no headlines, just laptops, coffee, and a whiteboard. "We broke a system," Maya said. "But we didn't erase it," Monique added. "It'll try to come back, in new suits, with new language." "Then we stay ahead of it," Zoe replied. "And build faster than it can replicate," Reagan finished. They didn't toast, they didn't celebrate. They just got back to work. What they had started was no longer about one company, or one takedown. It was about the quiet refusal to play a game built on erasure, and the louder, longer fight to create something no algorithm could predict. A system where the underestimated became architects, and justice wasn't a moment. It was a design. The rooftop terrace buzzed with quiet laughter and the clink of glasses. The view stretched across the bay, where container ships shimmered in the afternoon sun and electric ferries glided toward the wharf. 3 years had passed since the collapse of Vaughn Systems, and Equigrid's headquarters now sat atop a renovated warehouse in West Oakland. Once an abandoned logistics hub, now a living blueprint for what ethical innovation could look like. Inside the glass-walled studio, Monique Ellis adjusted her jacket and waited for the producer's countdown. She didn't love interviews, but this one mattered. "We're live in 3, 2... "Welcome back to New Vanguard," said the host, smiling into the camera. "Today, we're joined by Monique Ellis, founder of Equigrid and recently named Entrepreneur of the Year by the National Startup Council." The camera cut to her, poised and calm. "Monique, you've launched 28 startups in the last 36 months, supported over 600 founders, and influenced 3 major pieces of equity legislation. What's your secret?" "There's no secret," she said, her tone steady. "There's just hard truth. We inherited a system built to exclude, so we stopped trying to be included. We built a new table, and we didn't ask for permission." Cut to commercial. Outside, on the rooftop, rows of young founders sipped coffee and swapped notes on climate tech, blockchain equity tools, and trauma-informed product design. Each of them had come through Equigrid's accelerator not just for capital, but for a place to belong, to recover, and to rise without apology. Monique joined them after the shoot. She moved through the crowd quietly, asking about milestones, hiring needs, backlogs, and burn rates. Her clipboard was a permanent accessory. She took notes. She followed up. Across town, at the Founders Rebuild Foundation, Reagan Vaughn hosted a session with 3 first-time entrepreneurs from Tulsa, Detroit, and Baltimore. Each had been part of lawsuits stemming from the Vaughn suppression model. Each had won settlements. Now they were building again, with capital, legal guidance, and something they hadn't had before: infrastructure rooted in trust. Reagan sat on the edge of the desk, sleeves rolled up, sneakers scuffed. "You don't have to be perfect to deserve funding," she told them. "You don't have to look like what they're used to. You just have to build for real people and stay loud." When one of the founders asked how she managed to keep going, Reagan didn't answer right away. Then she said, "I used to think the worst thing I could do was disappoint my father. Turns out the worst thing would have been doing nothing." Meanwhile, in a D.C. hearing room, Maya Alston presented her second testimony before the Senate Subcommittee on Corporate Accountability. She wasn't asking for change anymore. She was drafting it. We need structural enforcement, not performative pledges. Transparency in venture capital flows. Civil protections for founders reporting discrimination. Independent oversight of startup suppression metrics in underwriting software. A senator leaned in, and who would monitor that? Maya smiled. "We will, alongside every founder who's ever been told they weren't the right fit." Zoe Kim, now a full-time CTO at Equigrid, rarely left the codebase, but she had just rolled out a new data-sharing agreement, an open-source ledger tracking anti-competitive behavior in procurement and funding cycles. It had already been downloaded by 8 state regulators and 2 federal agencies. On weekends, she taught middle school girls how to hack, not to destroy, but to defend. "We don't just need more coders," she told them, "we need guardians." And in a federal facility just outside Denver, Barrett Vaughn sat in a library corner, reading a dated copy of Wired. His face was leaner now, his posture stooped. His last appeal had been denied. His name was now a cautionary tale in business ethics seminars across the country. A new intern passed him without recognition. The old empire had faded, but the new one was growing. Back in Oakland, as the sky turned amber, Monique stood again on the rooftop. She looked out at the city, not as a battlefield, but as a blueprint. She wasn't trying to win anymore. She was trying to reroute what winning meant. Legacy, she once told Zoe, isn't what we leave behind. It's what we build that others can keep building. Downstairs, a new founder had just arrived. 22, formerly incarcerated, holding a prototype made from scrap parts and hope. Monique smiled. "Welcome to the table." Late that night, long after the rooftop crowd had gone home, and the hum of Oakland quieted into a soft mechanical hush, Monique Ellis stood alone at the edge of the terrace. The city below glowed in pulses. Window lights, traffic signals, motion sensors blinking in the distance. Behind her, the building was still buzzing. A young founder was troubleshooting a solar battery model in the corner. Someone else was printing a 3D prototype in the basement lab. But for a moment, Monique let the stillness settle. She thought back to the trunk of her SUV, where this all began. A broken-down engine, a stranger on the run, a choice to help when walking away would have been easier. She hadn't set out to build a movement. She had just been tired. Tired of fighting alone, tired of watching potential die in silence, tired of being told to wait her turn in a game where the rules were never written for her. But sometimes history doesn't start with a headline. It starts with a decision. To stay. To speak. To act. As the wind picked up, she closed her eyes and whispered a name, Voltage, the company she'd once poured herself into, the one that was never supposed to make it, the one that did, just not in the way she expected. Her success now wasn't about reclaiming what had been taken. It was about creating something that couldn't be taken at all. Inside, on a wall near the stairwell, a message had been spray-painted in black and green. Justice isn't retribution. It's redesign. To those watching this story unfold, you might feel inspired, maybe even empowered, and that's good. But don't stop there. Ask yourself, what systems do you walk through every day without questioning? Whose absence in boardrooms, classrooms, and contracts do you no longer even notice? Because justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins with discomfort, with disrupting comfort zones, especially when you're the one sitting comfortably. Founders like Monique aren't rare. They're just rarely funded, rarely protected, rarely believed. And yet, they keep building. The story you just watched is about more than exposing corruption. It's about rejecting narratives that reward exclusion and call it excellence. It's about naming the systems that flatten entire communities into data points. And most of all, it's about making different choices on hiring teams, investment panels, procurement policies, and everyday interactions. Monique didn't win by outplaying the system. She won by refusing to play by its terms. And Reagan? She proved that walking away from privilege isn't weakness. It's the beginning of accountability. Zoe and Maya? They showed us that real change isn't driven by ego but by collective courage. So, what now? Support the overlooked, fund the underestimated. Build slow if you must, but build fair. And when the moment comes, when silence seems safer than truth, remember that every broken system counts on your silence to survive. Don't give it what it wants. Because the real victory in this story wasn't toppling a billionaire or salvaging a lost startup. It was showing that people once dismissed as too radical, too emotional, too different, could design futures better than the ones they were excluded from. Futures where equity isn't a metric. It's the foundation.